In this lecture, we'll finish setting up our parallax scrolling. Our objectives will be to modify the main camera to only render the foreground layers, create a background camera that renders the background layer, and adjust the orthographic size on the background camera to achieve the parallax scrolling effect. So now that we have our background created and placed on the proper sorting layer and the proper layer, let's go ahead and set up our camera. So if we go ahead and look at the main camera, notice that the clear flags is currently set to skybox. What that means is it's going to render everything that we see, and then it's going to render the skybox. There isn't actually a skybox defined, so it defaults to that background color of blue. So I actually want to change this from skybox and choose depth only, which means it's going to render just the items that are defined down below under culling mask, and it won't render anything in the background. So you can see down in my game view, we see just this sort of dark gray background now, which basically represents transparency. Nothing is back there. So the next thing that we want to do is look at the culling mask. So once again, this is showing all the layers that it's going to render. Currently, it's rendering everything. So by putting those background elements on the background layer, we can actually turn this off. So let me just select background. That'll uncheck the background. And notice that from the game view, we no longer see those background elements. Of course, they still exist. They're up here in the scene view, and we can see them there and edit them there. But the camera, once again, notice the camera preview here, does not actually show that background layer since we just turned it off. So let's go ahead and create our second camera. Our second camera is what's going to actually render the background. So under the hierarchy, we'll go to Create and choose Camera. This creates a new camera, and notice that immediately our game view changed. We'll talk about that here in a moment. I'm going to go ahead and rename this as my background camera. So we need to go in and change some of the properties of the camera. First and foremost, this is set to a perspective camera. Let's go ahead and change this to orthographic like the main camera. We also need to adjust the location of the camera. So right now it's its own game object. I want to make this a child of the main camera because I want this camera to basically just follow everything the main camera does. Of course, we have that camera 2D follow script on the main camera, which tracks the player. And we want the background camera to just track and do everything the main camera does. So let me go ahead and make the background camera a child of the main camera. And then we want to make sure that this is positioned at the exact same location as the main camera. So since this is now a child of the main camera, we can just set its position to 0, 0, 0, which means it'll be right at the same location as its parent object. Notice in the game view, we can essentially see the whole game now because we haven't set up the rest of our properties on the camera. So essentially, this is just rendering everything. And right now, the background camera is actually rendering in front of the main camera. That property is defined here where it says depth. So the depth is 0 of the background camera, and the main camera, the depth is -1. So 0 is in front of -1. So if we go to the background camera, once again, let's set the depth to -2. So this is going to render behind the main camera. For clear flags, we'll leave skybox because, in this case, we do actually want to render that blue background, unlike the main camera, because this will be our farthest back camera. And then for the culling mask, we want to change from rendering everything to rendering nothing. So it unchecks everything. And you can see now we're just seeing the main camera down here in the game view. Let me click on culling mask again and choose just background. So now it'll render, what we see on the main camera. And then behind it, because we changed the depth, we're rendering just the background layer. So the other thing that we haven't changed yet is the size of the orthographic projection. So if you look at the main camera, the default size is 5. So both of them now have the same orthographic projection. If I actually change this to something like 8, notice what happens. Everything in the background looks a little more zoomed out. The larger the size, the larger the parallax effect that you're going to get. That is, the more distant the background layer will appear in relationship to the foreground layer. So let me actually set this just 1 up. So we'll go from 5 to 6. So we've got our camera property set up. Now, one other thing that we want to do is we actually want to turn off the audio listener. So by default, cameras have an audio listener component. Really, only one of these can be active in the scene at a time. So if I actually play right now, Notice that down here below the game view, I am getting a warning. If I actually open the console, notice it's continually outputting warnings that says there's 2 audio listeners in the scene. Please ensure that there's always exactly 1 audio listener in the scene. So we want to resolve that warning issue. It's not a game breaker, it doesn't crash your game, but it's inefficient, and Unity's confused what's going on. So let's go ahead and close the console and stop the game. So in the case of the background camera, we could just deactivate the audio listener. So it's not on, it's not there. Or of course we could always click the gear and actually remove the component, which I can do now. So now when I play, notice that I no longer get that error message. And if I move around, notice that I have this sort of parallax effect happening. So the mountains and the clouds are moving at a different speed, a slower speed than the foreground elements. So I've basically got my parallax effect working. Now I could go in and add additional cameras, so maybe have additional layer for sort of background 1, background 2. Maybe I put the clouds on background 1 and the mountains on background 2, and adjust the orthographic size for each camera. Have each camera render differently. Have the middle one be depth only clear flags, and then have the farthest back one be skybox, which would render the background. So you can actually have multiple levels of parallaxing. So let's go ahead and save our scene.